settle in for a moment, because tonight we're opening a medicine cabinet that most people in 1962 never talked about out loud. It belonged to an ordinary woman in an ordinary house on an ordinary street, and what was inside it tells you more about that decade than any history book written by someone who wasn't there. Tonight we're talking about Miltown, Valium, Seconal, and the vast, quiet, almost entirely unremarked upon pharmaceutical sedation of American housewives across 2 decades. A story that didn't make the front pages at the time, because the women it was happening to didn't make the front pages either. They made dinner. They made the beds. They made it look easy. And then they took a pill. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this is genuinely something you look forward to. And a real, heartfelt thank you to everyone who sends topic suggestions and kind messages. You shape what gets made here, and that means more than I can say in a subscribe button. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It is always somewhere deep into the night for someone, and I find that quietly comforting. If Spotify is more your speed for drifting off, the link is waiting in the description. Now, dim the lights. If you have a fan, turn it on. Pull that blanket up to somewhere around your collarbone and let your jaw go soft. Let your shoulders find the mattress. There's nowhere to be right now. But before we begin, let's sit with a few questions for just a moment. Have you ever wondered what a 1962 doctor wrote on his notepad when a housewife told him she felt purposeless and couldn't explain why? Have you considered what it felt like to be handed a prescription for a feeling that didn't have a name yet? Did the women opening those small amber bottles every morning know what was in them? And did they ask, and did anyone actually tell them? What happened inside the body of a woman who took the same tranquilizer every day for 7 years? And what happened the morning she didn't? Was there a moment, sitting at a kitchen table in a house that was perfectly clean and perfectly quiet, when the pill felt less like medicine and more like the walls coming in a little more gently than they usually did? How many women on a single street were taking the same white tablet at 8:30 in the morning without knowing that the woman 3 doors down had just done the same thing with her second cup of coffee? And what, exactly, did the men writing those prescriptions believe they were treating? Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1962. The kitchen floor is linoleum and it is spotless. The children have already left for school. Your husband left at 7:15, without saying very much. There is a bottle of Miltown in the medicine cabinet above the bathroom sink, wedged between the cold cream and the Breck shampoo. Your doctor gave you that prescription 3 months ago. He wrote it in about 45 seconds. Good morning. Let's begin. Let's start with what the day actually looked like before we get to what was in the cabinet, because you cannot understand the cabinet without first understanding the day. You woke at 6, or just before, not because you set an alarm, though you did, but because your body had been doing this long enough that it woke on its own, running a quiet inventory before the alarm even went off. The coffee had to be made before your husband came downstairs. The children's breakfast had to be underway before the school bus became a concern. The kitchen, which you had left clean the night before, had to remain visibly clean as it was used, which is a particular kind of task, the kind where you are cleaning while also producing the mess that requires the cleaning, simultaneously, without it showing. You had been awake at some point in the night as well, not in crisis, just surfacing at 2 or 3 in the way that women managing a great deal tend to surface, running the list. The dentist appointment that needed rescheduling, the school form still unsigned on the counter, the thing your husband said at dinner that you hadn't finished thinking about. Then back to sleep, or close enough to it, in the effortful way that passes for rest when your mind doesn't fully agree to stop. By the time he left for work, you had cooked, served, managed the children through the slow emergency of getting them dressed and presentable and out the door, and returned to a kitchen that looked like the morning had happened in it. The dishes were in the sink. The table needed wiping. The coffee cups required attention. None of this was difficult in the way that something technically complex is difficult. It was the other kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that accumulates across weeks and months and years until it sits somewhere in your chest as a weight that doesn't have a name because you've never been asked to name it. The morning, after they were all gone and the house was quiet, had a particular quality that the domestic guides of the era never mentioned, and the magazine photographs didn't capture. It was the quality of a long, full expanse of time that was completely without acknowledgement. There were things to do. There were always things to do. But none of them would be noticed as you did them, and none of them would register as finished when you finished them, because the nature of this kind of work was that it began again before the last iteration had cooled. The laundry you washed today would be laundry again in 48 hours. The floors you mopped this morning would need mopping again by Thursday. The meals you cooked and served and cleaned up after would need to be cooked again before the day was out. The work had no completion point. It had only the brief pause between one cycle and the next, and in 1962, that pause did not come with acknowledgement, or payment, or the basic professional dignity of being recognized as work at all. This is the daily life into which the Tranquilizer arrived, not into leisure, not into obvious crisis, into the specific, structurally invisible exhaustion of a role that asked everything and confirmed nothing. And the remarkable thing, looking back, is not that so many women were eventually prescribed something for it. It's that the medication was understood by the doctors prescribing it, and often by the women taking it as the correct and sufficient response. The problem was located inside the woman. Her nerves, her adjustment, her difficulty managing what other women, presumably, managed without difficulty. The solution was therefore also located inside the woman, in the form of a small white tablet that adjusted the chemistry of her response to her circumstances rather than the circumstances themselves. That framing would take another decade and a half to be seriously questioned. In 1962, it was simply medicine. Let's start with Miltown, because Miltown came first, and because the story of how Miltown arrived in 10 million medicine cabinets is the story of how an entire system learned to look at a woman and see a prescription. Miltown arrived in American pharmacies in 1955, and its rise was unlike anything the pharmaceutical industry had seen before. Within 2 years, it had become the fastest-selling prescription drug in American history. By 1957, 1 in 20 Americans had taken it. Celebrities mentioned it at dinner parties the way you'd mention a good scotch. Milton Berle joked about it on television. It showed up in gossip columns and advice pages and the casual conversation of people who had decided, correctly or otherwise, that this was simply what modern life required. The drug itself was meprobamate, a muscle relaxant with sedative properties, developed by a pharmacologist named Frank Berger, who had been looking for something that could ease anxiety without the dangerous dose ceiling of the barbiturates that came before it. Barbiturates worked, but the gap between a therapeutic dose and a fatal one was uncomfortably narrow. Meprobamate felt safer. It took the edge off without putting you under. It let you function, which was, for the population the drug would eventually reach, the most important thing. The name Miltown came from a small township in New Jersey near where the drug was developed as unremarkable a naming origin as the drug's purpose, which was the management of the unremarkable. Carter Wallace, the company that marketed it, aimed it initially at anxious executives, men in grey suits with briefcases and the legitimate professional stresses of the modern workplace. Men whose nerves had an externally verifiable cause, which meant their nerves were medically appropriate to address. What happened next was not what Carter Wallace had planned, or perhaps it was exactly what they had planned. Physicians began writing Miltown prescriptions for patients who bore no resemblance to the anxious executive. Housewives, women in their late 20s and 30s and 40s sitting across the desk, describing symptoms that didn't fit any clean category. A tiredness that sleep didn't fix. A restlessness without an object. A flatness that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite boredom and wasn't quite anything the available vocabulary could land on cleanly. The physician sitting across from you was, in almost every case, a man. This is not an incidental detail. He had been trained in a medical tradition with its own long and complicated history of categorizing women's psychological states as problems of constitution, of nerves, of female adjustment to the natural order of things. The possibility that what you were describing was a rational response to genuinely difficult conditions was not, in 1957, the first framework the medical literature offered him. What he saw, looking across the desk, was a woman whose domestic situation appeared adequate. You had a house, your husband had a salary, you had children, which was understood to be fulfilling by definition. If you were not finding it fulfilling, the problem was with your response to it. And that was a problem that medication could address. The prescription was written, You took it to the pharmacy on Elm Street or Main Street or whatever the street was, and the pharmacist, also a man, also in a white coat, filled it without particular comment. You brought it home. You put it in the medicine cabinet above the bathroom sink, next to the cold cream and the Breck shampoo, and the next morning you took one with your second cup of coffee. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the point. Miltown, at a therapeutic dose, produced a mild softening at the edges of everything. The tension in your shoulders that had become so constant you'd stopped registering it as tension loosened slightly. The list of things you needed to do was still long, but it felt a degree further away, as though someone had moved it to the next room. The sound of the children getting ready for school was slightly less like something that was happening to you. This was the drug working. It was not fixing anything. It was not changing the structure of your day, or the terms of your role, or the fact that no one was going to acknowledge what you did today, or ask how you were holding up. It was moving the walls back a few inches, creating a small buffer between you and the weight of it. And within that buffer, the day became slightly more survivable. Whether that was a good thing or a complicated thing depended on whether you believed medicine was supposed to address the symptom or the source. In 1957, almost everyone in a position to make that call believed they were the same thing. By the early 1960s, Miltown had competition. The competition was better designed, more aggressively marketed, and would outlast Miltown by decades. Valium, the brand name for diazepam, came out of the laboratories of Hoffmann-La Roche, a Swiss pharmaceutical company with American operations in Nutley, New Jersey. Leo Sternbach, the chemist who developed it, had spent years working on benzodiazepines, a class of compounds with a different mechanism than anything that had come before. What Sternbach found in diazepam was something that outperformed Miltown on nearly every measure that mattered to a prescribing physician. It worked faster, lasted longer, and at the doses being used in clinical practice, seemed to carry considerably less risk of overdose than the barbiturates it was replacing. Valium was approved by the FDA in 1963. For the next 13 years, it was the most prescribed drug in the United States. Read that again. 13 consecutive years. Through the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration and the Nixon administration and the Ford administration and into the Carter years, while the country moved through the civil rights movement and the moon landing and Watergate and the oil crisis and the long, slow unwinding of the post-war consensus, American physicians were writing Valium prescriptions at a rate that peaked in 1978 at approximately 2.3 billion tablets per year. The majority of those prescriptions, in every year of that period, went to women. The ratio varied by study, but the consistent finding across the clinical literature was that women received roughly twice as many prescriptions for tranquilizers and sedatives as men did. This was understood at the time, when it was understood at all, as a biological fact. Women were simply more prone to anxiety, a nervous disposition. What the data actually reflected was a social situation producing predictable psychological symptoms, being treated with a pharmaceutical product that addressed the symptoms while leaving the situation entirely in place. You were not, in most cases, taking Valium because you asked for it. You were taking it because your physician, presented with a collection of symptoms that didn't map neatly onto any clean diagnosis, decided that anxiety was the closest available category and Valium was the indicated response. The prescription was written. The refills came automatically, month after month, sometimes year after year. Nobody scheduled a follow-up to ask whether anything had changed. Nothing had changed. What Valium did inside your body was bind to the GABA receptors in your brain, the receptors responsible for quieting neural activity, for turning down the electrical noise that produced anxiety and tension, and the particular wired exhaustion of someone who had been managing too much for too long. It enhanced those receptors' effect, making your brain's natural calming system work harder than it could on its own. The result was a loosening, a gentling, not unconsciousness, not the obvious impairment of someone who had taken too much of something, just a distance placed between you and the sharp edges of the day. You could still cook and wipe the counter and pick the children up at 3:15 and have something ready on the stove when your husband got home at 6:20. You were doing all of it. You were just doing it from slightly further inside yourself, from behind a layer of chemical calm so thin and so constant that after a few months you had stopped noticing it was there. It had become the baseline. It had become normal. It had become what the day felt like. This was the thing about Valium that took years to understand and longer to address. It worked. That was the problem. The anxiety receded. The tension softened. The day became manageable. And because it worked, and because the conditions producing the anxiety were not changing, and because no one in your life and very few people in your medical care were asking whether the anxiety might be trying to tell you something worth hearing, you kept taking it. The keeping taking was the part no one had fully accounted for. Benzodiazepines produce physical dependence with regular use. The brain, exposed consistently to a compound that enhances its inhibitory receptors, begins to compensate. It reduces its own natural output of calming neurotransmitters. It adjusts to the new chemistry, and in adjusting, it becomes reliant on the drug to maintain the equilibrium it has restructured itself around. This process, physiological dependence, was understood in the laboratory before Valium reached pharmacies. Whether it was communicated clearly to the women receiving it, or to the physicians prescribing it, is a question the historical record answers without much comfort. If you had been taking Valium for 2 years and decided to stop, you would discover that stopping was not as simple as leaving the bottle in the cabinet. The withdrawal symptoms, which no one mentioned when the prescription was written, included anxiety, insomnia, the specific physical tension and restlessness that had brought you to the doctor's office in the first place. In other words, you felt exactly as you had felt before you started, which made it nearly impossible to know whether you were withdrawing from the drug or simply discovering that you had needed it all along. Many physicians, when presented with a patient describing these symptoms after stopping Valium, did not interpret them as withdrawal. They interpreted them as evidence that the prescription had been correct and renewed it. This is not a story with clear villains. The doctors writing Valium prescriptions in 1966 were working within the available medical consensus. The pharmaceutical companies promoting the drug were operating in a regulatory environment that did not yet have the tools to track long-term population-level dependency. The women taking the pills were following the advice of people with authority and medical degrees. The problem was not in any individual decision. It was in the sum of the decisions, millions of prescriptions across 2 decades that amounted to the routine chemical management of women whose distress had identifiable external causes that no one was particularly motivated to address. The tranquilizers handled the day. The night required different management. Sleep, for many women in the 1950s and early 1960s, was not the uncomplicated biological event it was supposed to be. Your body, which had been tense since 6 in the morning, did not automatically release at 10 o'clock simply because the house was quiet and the lights were off. Your mind, which had been running its inventory all day, continued running it in the dark, and in the silence, the running was louder. Seconal was one of the drugs waiting in the cabinet for exactly this problem. A barbiturate, its active compound secobarbital. It came in a red capsule, vivid and distinctive in its small amber bottle, and it was effective in a way that left no ambiguity. You took Seconal and you slept. Not the gradual dissolving of natural sleep, but something more decided, a trapdoor that opened cleanly and reliably beneath consciousness. That reliability was the appeal, and also the danger. Barbiturates suppress the central nervous system breathing, heart rate, brain activity, all of it slowing together. The distance between a dose that produced sleep and a dose that produced something else was narrow enough to be a genuine risk, especially in combination with alcohol, which was present in many of the same homes and many of the same evenings. You were not thinking about pharmacology when you reached for it at 10:50. You were thinking about the 6 o'clock alarm, about the fact that the last 3 nights had been thin and unreliable, and the day coming toward you tomorrow needed you functional. You were thinking about the children's lunches and whether the dry cleaning was ready to pick up and the thing your husband had mentioned needing done by Thursday. You were thinking, in the way you always thought before sleep in those years, in lists and logistics, in the small administrative language of a life managed entirely by one person without acknowledgement and with very little margin for error. The Seconal was efficient. Within 20 minutes of taking it, the lists became quieter. Within 30 you were under, in the decisive, unambiguous way that the drug produced sleep, not drifting toward it but arriving there, and the arrival had none of the texture of natural sleep, no gradual softening. No intermediate zone of warmth and loosening, just consciousness and then its absence, the trapdoor, and then the alarm at 6 and you back at the sink making coffee, the red capsule from last night already metabolized, already gone, already replaced by the 8:30 Valium that was waiting for you in the medicine cabinet above the sink. What no one was calculating in most of these households was the cumulative total. The Valium at 8:30, still measurably present in your bloodstream at noon when the second dose went in. The cocktail before dinner, a gin and tonic, or a whiskey sour, which was the social lubricant of the suburban evening, and which combined with the remaining benzodiazepine in your system in ways that neither your internist nor your gynecologist had a clear view of, because they were not talking to each other and were not asking about each other's prescriptions. The Seconal at 10:50 moving through a system that had been chemically managed since morning, each individual element prescribed separately, understood in isolation as a reasonable response to a reasonable problem. Added together, in the body of one woman, on one Tuesday in October, in one house on one street of a suburb where the same combination was being managed, in some variation, in several of the other houses, by several of the other women, none of whom knew about each other because this was not a thing that came up at the neighborhood coffee. The physician who saw you for the Miltown did not know about the Seconal. The physician who renewed the Valium did not know about the Miltown. The pharmacist who filled all 3 prescriptions might have noticed the accumulation, and in some cases did, and in many cases did not, because noticing was not a system requirement, and the pharmacist was busy and the prescriptions were legal, and the women presenting them were functioning adults who had seen a doctor. The Miltown or Valium at 8:30. The noon dose with lunch. The cocktail before dinner, which was a standard feature of the suburban evening, and which combined with the remaining benzodiazepine in your bloodstream in ways that neither the internist, nor the gynecologist, nor the pharmacist filling 3 separate prescriptions had a complete view of, because the system was not structured to have a complete view. Each physician knew his piece. Nobody was holding the whole picture. You move through the days the way a person moves when they are chemically managed rather than rested, not impaired in any way that registered from the outside. You went to the school play and applauded at the right moments. You attended the neighborhood association meeting and took notes in your careful handwriting and volunteered for the hospitality committee because it was your turn and the hospitality committee needed someone organized. You went to the Jewel or the A&P and worked through the grocery list you had written on Wednesday morning, organized by section produce, then the meat counter, then dairy, then the center aisles because working by section was more efficient and efficiency was what the household required, and you had internalized the requirements of the household to the point where they were no longer requirements, but simply the way you move through the world. From the outside, perfectly fine. From the inside, slightly further away than you used to be. This was the quality that women who later wrote or spoke about this period returned to most consistently. Not sedation in the clinical sense, not the inability to function, the softening of the self, a reduced access to the full register of your own emotional response. You were there for everything. You simply weren't quite all there, in the way that the difference between being fully present and being present from a slight distance is invisible to everyone in the room except the person experiencing the distance. The word they used most often, in retrospect, was numb, not a painful numbness. Not a dramatic one, just the mild, sustained numbness of a hand that's been in cold water long enough that sensation arrives slightly delayed and slightly muffled, and you can still use the hand perfectly well, and nobody looking at it would know, and you've been living with it long enough that you've stopped noticing it isn't quite right. Let's follow you through a Tuesday afternoon in October 1964. October because the light is particular, slow and pale, making the hours feel longer than they are. Tuesday because it is the day furthest from both the weekend just past and the weekend still to come, and that specific distance has a texture in a quiet house that's hard to describe and hard to escape. You took your Valium at 8:30, after the children left, with the second cup of coffee. The prescription said 1 tablet 3 times daily as needed. The as needed had become, over 7 months, a formality. It was always needed. This was simply what the day required. By 10 you had done the breakfast dishes, wiped the stove, put a load in the Maytag in the basement, and made the beds. The beds alone were a sequence. The children's beds. Fast, functional, tuck, and smooth. Your own bed, the one visible from the hallway, the one that said something about you to anyone who came upstairs, took longer. You tucked the corners the way you had always tucked them. You smoothed the surface flat with your palm, moving from the center outward. You placed the decorative pillows in the arrangement you'd been using for 6 years, the arrangement that indicated a properly made bed, and you stepped back and looked at it, and it was correct. Downstairs, the Maytag ran itself. This was the piece of household equipment you had the least complicated relationship with, because for 26 minutes it required nothing from you. You'd loaded it and measured the tide and set the dial and pulled the knob, and it was handling something useful while you stood in the kitchen considering what came next. There was always something that came next. The Valium did something specific to this moment, the moment of standing in the kitchen looking at the day. Without it, the day presented itself as an urgency, a physical sensation in the chest, a low hum of must and should and haven't yet. With it, the same day presented itself as a list, manageable, at a slight remove. You could look at it without your sternum tightening. This was the drug working correctly. This was what the prescription was for. You understood that. What you were less certain about, in the quieter parts of the afternoon, was whether the thing the drug was managing was something that should be managed, or something that should be heard. The thought arrived occasionally. You had not yet found a place to put it. The noon Valium came with a glass of water at the kitchen sink, and this one you noticed less than the morning dose, because the morning dose was still in your system, and the noon one was maintenance rather than correction. The ironing waited in the spare room. A man's dress shirt in 1964 was 6 distinct operations: collar, cuffs, sleeves, body, left front panel, right front panel, with the buttons requiring individual negotiation. You had ironed this shirt, or one indistinguishable from it, more times than you had ever counted. Your hands moved through the sequence without instruction. The radio was on, tuned to the station that played orchestrated, instrumental arrangements of songs that had been popular 2 or 3 years ago. Music chosen, it seemed, specifically to fill air without asking anything of the person breathing it. The children came home at 3:15. The transition from the medicated stillness of the afternoon to the management of children who were loud and hungry and needed things was the moment each day when you could most clearly feel what the drug was doing. Not that you couldn't manage. You could, you did. But you were managing from a slight distance, the way a very competent person manages a situation they are professionally equipped for but are not quite fully inside. You could see what was needed and supply it. You just felt like you were standing one step further back than you used to stand. You set out the snacks. The children talked. You asked the right questions and listened to the answers, and the afternoon moved forward the way Tuesday afternoons moved forward in well-managed houses, and you were present for all of it. You were just slightly further away than you used to be. At 5:30 you changed your dress. This was not optional. The domestic guides of the era, and there were many, and they circulated widely through the Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping, and the pamphlets that arrived with new appliances were consistent on this point. The dress you had cooked and cleaned in all day was to be exchanged, before your husband came home, for something that communicated that you had not been cooking and cleaning all day. The presentation of the early evening, the composed wife at the door, the drink ready, the kitchen smelling of whatever was in the oven, was a managed performance. And you knew it was a performance. And he knew on some level it was a performance, and the agreement between you was that the performance would be maintained because the alternative was having the conversation about what the alternative would look like, and no one was ready for that conversation in 1964. The third Valium went down with a glass of water in the bathroom at 5:25, which you now thought of as the transition dose, the one that smoothed the handoff between the day you had actually had and the evening you were about to perform. He came home at 6:20. Dinner was at a stage where it could wait. The children were fed and doing homework in the kitchen. You were in the living room with a drink, and when he came through the door you said the right things about his day, and he said the right things about dinner, and the children appeared at the appropriate moment, and the evening moved through its sequence with the reliability of something that had been run enough times to have found its own momentum. After dinner, his contribution was the paper in the living room. Yours was the children's baths and bedtime and the kitchen. You moved through it efficiently. You had been moving through it efficiently for years. By 9:30, the house was quiet again, the kitchen clean, the children asleep, the two of you in the living room in the specific companionable silence of a long marriage in which the silences have long since sorted themselves into hostile and neutral, and this one was neutral. The television on, the day finally still. He went up at 10:30. You stayed another 20 minutes, which was the portion of the day that belonged exclusively to you, which was also the portion in which the Valium's effect was thinnest, and the particular flatness of the day most visible in the quiet, with nothing left to manage and nowhere to put your attention except inward. And inward was where the thought was waiting, the one about whether what the drug was managing was something that should be managed or something that should be heard. You took the Seconal at 10:50, turned off the television, checked the front door, turned off the kitchen light, went upstairs. The pharmaceutical industry behind all of this was not passive. The advertising that Roche ran for Valium in medical journals throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s is some of the most analysed material in the history of American medicine, because it communicates with unusual clarity what the industry understood about who its patient was and what its patient needed. A 1,965 advertisement for Seconal, a related tranquilizer, ran in the Journal of the American Medical Association, with copy describing the drug as suitable for the anxiety that comes from not fitting in. The illustration showed a woman in a kitchen. She was alone. Her expression communicated the specific quality of purposeless unease that the drug was designed to address. The advertisement did not suggest she find more meaningful work. It did not suggest her physician ask why she felt she didn't fit in. It offered the drug. Across the decade, the visual language of Valium advertising was almost perfectly consistent. Women appeared in domestic settings, kitchens, waiting rooms, the kinds of spaces that communicated a life organized entirely around the needs of others. Men, when they appeared, were in offices. The implied logic of the juxtaposition, never stated but legible on every page. Male anxiety had a legitimate professional origin. Female anxiety had a domestic one. Both could be treated with the same prescription. The Roche campaign that attracted the most critical attention showed a middle-aged woman surrounded by textbooks. The copy explained that she had a college degree and nowhere to use it. The suggested response was Valium, not continuing education, not a career. Not a structural change to the life that was producing the feeling, a pill, a buffer between the woman and her awareness of the distance between who she was and what the decade had decided she should be doing with it. The Rolling Stones noticed, in their way. In 1966 they recorded Mother's Little Helper, and the title was already a phrase in circulation, a knowing, darkly humorous nickname for the tranquilizers that suburban housewives were taking in quantities that were becoming difficult to ignore. The song was sympathetic, after a fashion. It was also a hit, which meant the situation it described was recognizable enough to be a commercial proposition, which means the situation was not a secret. It was just a thing that was happening, and was understood to be happening, and was not considered to require more than a 3-minute song's worth of attention. The reckoning came slowly, from several directions, and arrived later than it should have. The feminist movement of the late 1960s and early 1970s gave women a framework for describing what had been happening that the medical literature had not provided. In consciousness-raising groups in living rooms and community centres across the country, women who had been taking Miltown and Valium and Librium for years began comparing notes. The comparison was clarifying. What had felt, in isolation, like a personal failing, an inability to manage the correct way, began to look, in conversation, like a system. The drugs, examined in this light, were not medicine so much as a mechanism, not a conspiracy, a system. The difference being that a conspiracy requires intent, and a system only requires a set of incentives aligned in a particular direction, which they were. Betty Friedan had already named part of it. The feminine mystique arrived in 1963, the same year Valium received FDA approval, and its central contribution giving language to the problem that has no name was exactly the contribution that the women sitting in those doctors' offices had needed and not had. If you were one of those women, if you had been trying to describe your flatness and your restlessness and your inability to feel quite right inside a life that looked, by every available measure, exactly as it should, you would have found in Friedan's book a description of your experience that no physician's notepad had been able to produce. The problem that has no name was the same problem the Valium was being prescribed to address: a life structured entirely around the needs of others, a set of capacities with no available outlet, a performance of contentment maintained at sufficient effort across sufficient years that the effort itself had become the exhaustion. The physicians heard this described and wrote prescriptions. The book named it as something else entirely. You may have read it at the kitchen table, in the quiet after the children left. You may have read it in sections, the way you read everything in those years, a paragraph here, a page before bed, interrupted, returned to, interrupted again. You may have lent it to the woman 3 houses down, or received it from her, without either of you saying very much about why you were passing it along, because the words for why had not quite arrived yet. But you read it, a great many women read it, and reading it was, for many of them, the beginning of the end of accepting the prescription as the sufficient response. The clinical literature, caught up in the late 1970s, driven largely by the British psychiatrist Malcolm Lader at the Institute of Psychiatry in London, whose research demonstrated that long-term benzodiazepine use produced measurable, lasting changes in brain chemistry, that withdrawal was a genuine physiological event, distinct from the return of the original anxiety, and that a significant proportion of patients who had been on these drugs for years could not simply stop without structured medical support. This was news to many of the physicians who had been writing the refills. It was not news to the women who had been trying to stop. You had tried. In the bathroom, alone, cutting the tablets in half, and then smaller with a kitchen knife on the edge of the sink, spacing the doses further apart 10 hours instead of 8, 12, instead of 10, managing the returning anxiety and the insomnia, and the specific crawling restlessness of withdrawal, without telling anyone, because stopping a prescription was not the kind of thing you discussed at the bridge table or mentioned to your husband, because discussing it would require explaining how long you'd been taking it, and why and what the day actually felt like without it, and none of those conversations existed yet in the form you needed them. The symptoms of withdrawal felt, from the inside, indistinguishable from the symptoms that had generated the original prescription. The anxiety returned, the sleep fragmented. The tension that had lived in your shoulders since before you could remember came back in the first week off the drug, with a specificity that made it hard to know whether you were withdrawing or simply confirming that the drug had been necessary all along. This was the clinical trap, and it caught many women in exactly this way. The withdrawal looked like relapse, the relapse argued for the prescription renewed itself, and another year passed. You went back to the physician. You described what was happening. He interpreted what you described as evidence that the original prescription had been correct. He renewed it. He did not describe withdrawal to you because he did not, in 1969, have a fully adequate clinical picture of benzodiazepine withdrawal to describe. The stopping was hard. Harder than anything the decade had prepared you for. Harder than the years of managing the household on reduced emotional capacity. Harder than the slow erosion of access to your own full feeling. It required going back to the same system that had given you the prescription and asking that system to help you stop, which was its own particular irony that you were expected to absorb without making a scene. Some women stopped. They came through the withdrawal and emerged into a world that had shifted considerably since the prescriptions began. The late 1970s was not 1963. The language existed now. The books existed. The conversations in living rooms and community centres had been happening long enough to have produced something durable. Women who had spent a decade on Valium and come off it found themselves in a world where the anger they had been chemically prevented from fully feeling had, in the years of their partial absence from it, become organised. By 1978, Valium prescriptions peaked. By 1980, they were falling. The FDA began requiring clearer patient labelling. The prescribing culture shifted not immediately, not completely, but the consensus that had made a Valium prescription for a restless housewife routine slowly eroded under the pressure of the clinical evidence and the testimony of the women who had lived it. Physicians became more cautious. Patients became more informed. The benzodiazepine era did not end cleanly, but it began to end. What replaced it was not silence. The pharmaceutical management of women's distress relocated rather than resolved into the antidepressants of the 1980s and the SSRIs of the 1990s, different drugs with different mechanisms and different cultural narratives wrapped around them. The pattern of women receiving pharmaceutical responses to conditions with identifiable structural causes did not disappear when Valium's moment passed. It adapted. It is adapting still. The amber bottles are gone from those particular cabinets. The women who kept them there are in their 80s and 90s now, the ones still living, and most of them never spoke about it publicly. It was private. The way everything that happened inside the domestic sphere in those decades was private. The performance was the house. The house was the performance. What happened inside it stayed inside it. But the congressional hearings came, in the early 1980s, when the dependency issue became impossible to ignore. And the women who testified at those hearings spoke in the careful language of people saying publicly something they had carried privately for a very long time. What they described was not sedation in the dramatic sense. Not the obvious impairment of someone who had taken too much. They described a quality of distance, a removal from the full experience of their own lives, a sustained slight numbness that they had lived inside so long they had stopped registering it as numbness. It had become what normal felt like. And then they stopped, or tried to, and the numbness receded, and the full feeling came back sharp, unmediated, slightly overwhelming, and they thought, I had forgotten this was what things felt like. The full feeling is not always comfortable. It was not comfortable in 1974, sitting at the kitchen table with the medicine cabinet closed, and the day arriving with nothing between you and it. The anxiety was back. The restlessness was back. The awareness of the terms of your life, and of the distance between those terms and what you might have wanted, if wanting had ever been part of the arrangement, was back. But it was yours. The awareness, uncomfortable as it was your own unfiltered response to your own actual life, and that after 7 years of Valium was something you had not fully had access to. You put the kettle on, you sat down at the kitchen table. The day was going to be what it was going to be, and you were going to feel it, clearly, without assistance, in the way people feel things when nothing is standing between them and the feeling. That was a start. There is a particular kind of knowledge that spreads through suburbs without ever being spoken directly, and the knowledge of the tranquilizer spread exactly that way. You did not hear about Miltown at a dinner party, at least not announced. You heard it the way you heard most things in 1957, obliquely, in the gaps between other conversations. A neighbour mentioning while discussing something else entirely, that she had been feeling much better lately, much more herself, and her doctor had been very helpful. The phrase her doctor had been very helpful, delivered in a specific tone, meant something you were expected to understand without requiring elaboration. You understood it, you filed it. You moved on to discussing whether the Hendersons were going to repaint their shutters, because that was what the conversation was doing next, and that was where you followed it. But you had heard. And sometime in the following weeks, when the particular weight of the particular Tuesday morning reached the precise point where it became something you could not continue to manage without addressing it, you found yourself in your doctor's office describing your symptoms with a vocabulary that was, without your having planned it, already organized toward a specific outcome. The physician's office in 1957 was a room that communicated authority with considerable efficiency. The desk was large and wooden and sat between you and the physician, in a way that left no ambiguity about who was on which side of the professional relationship. He had a framed diploma on the wall, a stethoscope around his neck or on the desk in front of him, and the particular quality of patient attention that physicians develop across years of listening to people describe things they don't have quite the right words for. He listened. He asked questions. His questions had a direction, and the direction was toward a category, and the category he was moving toward, for a woman in her early 30s sitting across his desk in 1957, describing fatigue and restlessness and a vague inability to feel quite right inside her life, was anxiety. Anxiety was a real category. It described a real cluster of symptoms. The problem was not that the diagnosis was false. The problem was that it was insufficient that it named the symptom without accounting for the source, and that the treatment it implied addressed the symptom in a way that left the source not only unexamined, but, in a structural sense, protected from examination. If the problem was your anxiety, the problem was inside you, which meant the problem was yours to fix, or to manage, or to medicate, and the structure of your days was not implicated. He wrote the prescription. He explained that this would help with the nerves. He told you to come back in 6 weeks if it wasn't helping. He moved on to the next patient. The entire appointment had taken 12 minutes. You took the prescription to the pharmacy and stood at the counter, while the pharmacist, a man named Gerald or Thomas or whatever the name was, on the white coat behind the counter counted out the tablets and put them in the amber bottle and typed the label and handed it to you across the counter, with brief instructions about dosage and no information about anything else, because the anything else had not yet been established as information that required communicating. You drove home. You put the bottle in the medicine cabinet. You made lunch. The first time you took one, it was a Wednesday. You remember Wednesdays as the day the week turned toward itself, the day when the optimism of Monday was fully exhausted and the relief of Friday was still too far away to constitute a resource. The children were at school. Your husband was at the office. The morning's tasks were behind you and the afternoon's tasks were in front of you, and in between them, in the specific quiet of a clean house at 11:15 on a Wednesday, you were aware of a quality in the air that you couldn't name and had never tried to name because naming it would have required a conversation you didn't know how to start with anyone. You took the tablet with a glass of water at the kitchen sink. You put the glass down, you went into the living room and sat on the sofa and waited, though you weren't sure what you were waiting for. What arrived, over the next 40 minutes, was not happiness. It was not relief in any dramatic sense. It was more like a slight reduction in the frequency of a sound you hadn't known was constantly playing, the background hum of must and should and haven't yet and what if and is this. It didn't stop. It quieted, and in the quieting you discovered that the quiet itself was something you hadn't experienced in a very long time, possibly years, and that in its absence you had stopped knowing it was possible. This was the first morning. You went back to doing what you needed to do. The afternoon's tasks were still there. You did them. But you did them from slightly further inside the quiet, and the quiet made them manageable in a way that they had not been, quite, for longer than you could accurately account for. You went back to the physician 6 weeks later and told him it was helping. He renewed the prescription. He said he was glad to hear it. The prescription was renewed 7 more times before either of you thought to examine whether the original condition had changed. What the original condition had done in those 7 6-week intervals was not change. It had continued. The laundry had continued, and the meals had continued, and the management of the household had continued, and the performance of the evening had continued, and the Miltown had continued alongside all of it, adjusting the chemistry of your response to your circumstances, while your circumstances themselves remained entirely and permanently in place. By 1959, you were one of approximately 1 million American women for whom some variation of this sequence had occurred. The number was not publicly known because no one was aggregating it. What was known, in the pharmaceutical sales data and the prescription records and the inventory orders from pharmacies from Connecticut to California, was that meprobamate was moving through the distribution system in quantities that had not been anticipated and were not slowing down. Carter Wallace did not discourage this. They expanded their manufacturing capacity and their sales force and their presence in medical journals, and the advertisements they placed in those journals reaching the physicians who were writing the prescriptions reinforced the category of the anxious housewife with a consistency that amounted, across thousands of pages and several years, to a definition. You were the anxious housewife. The category existed before you did, and when you walked into your physician's office in 1957, you walked into a room that had been, in a certain sense, expecting you. The Suburb itself was a system that produced specific outcomes, and one of the outcomes it produced was the particular kind of isolation that made the tranquilizer not just appealing but, for many women, functionally necessary. The post-war American suburb was built around the automobile and the assumption of male employment and female domestic management, and what it produced, physically, was a landscape in which you could live in proximity to hundreds of other people and have very little daily contact with them that was not mediated by a social performance. The houses were close enough to see each other's lights. The driveways were adjacent, but the distances between them, absent a car and an occasion, were sufficient to make the casual drop-in rare, the unmediated conversation rarer, and the sense of being genuinely connected to the people 3 doors down, something that required effort to maintain. The telephone helped. Long daily calls between women who had been neighbours for years were a feature of the suburban landscape that the men in those households did not always appreciate and did not always understand, because the calls looked, from the outside, like conversation about trivial things, recipes and children, and the Hendersons' shutters, and were, in fact, the infrastructure of female social life, in a landscape that had not provided any other kind. But the telephone was not the same as presence. And the social calls, the morning coffees, the afternoon visits, the carefully managed occasions of the suburban social calendar were not the same as honesty. The social life of the suburb ran on the same performance that the household ran on, which was the performance of contentment. And the performance, by its nature, excluded the information that would have most benefited the women performing it. You did not mention, over coffee at your neighbour's kitchen table, that you were having difficulty feeling interested in your days and that your physician had recently prescribed something for it. You mentioned that your hydrangeas were coming in well this year and that you had found a good new recipe for the casserole, and that your younger child had done very well in the school play. Your neighbour mentioned the same kinds of things: her hydrangeas, her casserole, her child, and in the kitchen cabinet above her bathroom sink, which you had never seen and would not see, there was a bottle that looked very much like the bottle in yours. Neither of you knew this. Neither of you said so. The performance did not have a mechanism for this particular disclosure, and in the absence of the mechanism, the disclosure did not occur, and the isolation that had made the prescription necessary continued undisturbed beneath the social surface of a very pleasant Tuesday morning coffee. This was not cruelty. It was architecture. The architecture of the suburb, physical and social, had been designed around certain assumptions about how women's lives would be organised, and those assumptions did not include the possibility that the organisation would be experienced as isolating, or that the isolation would produce distress, or that the distress would require management, or that the management would be pharmaceutical and would be occurring simultaneously in most of the houses on the street. The design did not account for any of this because the design had not been asked to. The women whose lives the design organised had not been consulted in its making, and the period in which they might have raised concerns was not a period that had established mechanisms for the raising of such concerns by women. So the suburb was built, and the women moved into it, and the isolation was real, and the distress was real, and the prescriptions were written and filled and renewed, and the bottles accumulated in the medicine cabinets above the sinks of the clean bathrooms of the identical houses on the streets that had been built on the assumption that everything was fine. Everything, from the outside, looked fine. The physician had a name. He was not a villain. This bears saying because the story of the pharmaceutical sedation of a generation of housewives can, told quickly, acquire the shape of a story about villains, and the shape is incorrect. The physician had a name. Call him Dr. Whitmore, or Dr. Patterson, or whatever the name was. On the door of the medical practice, on the second floor of the professional building, on the main commercial street of the suburb, and he had graduated from a good medical school and completed a residency, and joined a practice and built a patient roster over 15 years of conscientious clinical work. He was not indifferent to his patients. He was, in the assessment of his patients, a kind man. He remembered details. He asked about the children. When you came into his office describing fatigue and restlessness and the vague inability to feel quite right, he listened with genuine attention, leaning forward slightly with his hands folded on the desk, and he heard what you were describing, which was a real thing that was actually happening to you, and he responded with the tools and the framework that 15 years of medical training and clinical practice had given him. The tools were Miltown, later Valium. The framework was anxiety, which was a real category applied to a real cluster of symptoms, and which in your case was also insufficient, which he did not know because the insufficiency was not visible from inside the framework he had. He could not, from his position, see what you were sitting inside. He could see you a woman in her 30s, well-dressed, articulate, clearly intelligent, describing symptoms that mapped onto a known category. He could not see the structure of the days producing those symptoms, because you did not describe the structure of the days, because the structure of the days was not what you went to the doctor about. You went to the doctor about the feeling. The feeling had a name. The name had a treatment. The treatment was written down and handed to you across the large wooden desk. He saw 12 more patients that afternoon. He went home for dinner. His wife had it ready. Let's go further into the medicine cabinet itself, because the cabinet, if you opened it in 1963 and looked at what was there, was a kind of autobiography in amber bottles. There was the Miltown, or the Valium, if the prescription had been updated. There was the Seconal, or possibly the Nembutal, another barbiturate, a yellow capsule rather than a red one, sometimes prescribed when Seconal was unavailable, or when the physician preferred a slightly different dosing profile. There may have been Librium, Claudiase epoxide, the first of the benzodiazepines to reach American pharmacies, approved in 1960 and prescribed widely to women who found Miltown insufficient. There was almost certainly aspirin, and a bottle of Geritol, the iron tonic, advertised with the specific suggestion that the tired housewife's fatigue was a symptom of iron-poor blood, which it sometimes was, and which it sometimes was not, but which was in any case a category of problem that had an over-the-counter solution that cost considerably less than a physician visit. There was the dexedrine, possibly. Amphetamines, specifically dextroamphetamine, marketed under the dexedrine brand, and also appearing in various combination products, including the diet pills that were prescribed with considerable enthusiasm throughout the late 1950s and 1960s to women whose physicians had decided that weight management was a component of their healthcare. Dexedrine was a stimulant. It produced energy, reduced appetite, elevated mood. It was, for many of the women taking it, the morning counterpart to the Valium, the thing that got you up and moving and functional in the early hours, which the Valium would later smooth into something sustainable. The combination stimulant in the morning, tranquilizer through the day, barbiturate at night was not prescribed as a system. It assembled itself, prescription by prescription, physician by physician, in the medicine cabinet of a woman whose healthcare was being managed by specialists who did not speak to each other, across a body that was expected to be functional at 7 in the morning and composed at 6 in the evening, and unconscious by 11, and ready to begin again at 6 the next morning. The pharmacological load this represented was, by contemporary standards, extraordinary. By the standards of 1963, it was unremarkable. It was simply what the cabinet contained. It was simply what the day required. The diet pills deserve a paragraph of their own, because they existed in a separate cultural register from the tranquilizers, even when they were being taken simultaneously. The tranquilizers were medical. They were prescribed for a condition. They were not discussed at the beauty parlor or at the grocery store. The diet pills were social. They were discussed. They were compared. They were recommended between women the way recipes were recommended, with the specific excitement of something that worked, or seemed to, and that was producing the results that the culture of the era was requiring women to produce. The culture of the era was requiring women to be thin. Not the contemporary version of thin, which is its own complicated subject, but a specific post-war American version of thin that was organized around the nipped waist of the new look silhouette that Dior had introduced in 1947, and that had defined the aesthetic of women's clothing throughout. 1950s, the belted dress, the full skirt, the waist that demonstrated its dimensions. Being the correct size for the correct dress was, in 1960, not a personal preference. It was a social expectation with consequences for how you were perceived by your husband, your neighbors, your physician, and the magazines that arrived monthly to tell you how you were doing. The diet pills made the correct size more achievable. They also made the Valium more necessary, because dexedrine taken in the morning produced an alertness and a tension that ran through the day and did not release at 5 o'clock simply because you had changed your dress and put on a fresh face. The Valium smoothed the dexedrine. The dexedrine countered the Valium. The Seconal knocked down the residue of both. And in the morning you began again, and the cabinet above the sink was full, and you were managing. You were always managing. The children saw something, though they did not know what they were seeing. Children who grew up in the households where this was happening absorbed it the way children absorb everything. not as information they had processed and filed, but as texture, as the specific quality of their domestic environment that became, for them, what normal felt like. The mother who was always there, always functional, always managing, was a mother whose always came with a quality to it that the children could not have named and did not have the framework to analyze. She was there. She was competent. She was warm, in the measured, sustained, slightly tired way that warmth looks when it is being produced at consistent effort over a long period. What she was not, in those years, was fully present in the way that the word present means, when it means something more than physically located in the room. She was there. She was just slightly further away than she would have been. The children felt this as a texture and did not know it was a texture. They experienced her consistency as love, which it was. They experienced her tiredness as the natural condition of mothers, which it seemed to be, because all the mothers they knew had it. They experienced the quality of her attention genuine, responsive, slightly filtered as the way attention worked, because it was the only example of it they had. Some of them, decades later, in the specific light of retrospect, would understand what they had been in the presence of, would recognize, in the memories of their mothers in those kitchens in those years, something that had not had a name when they were children but had one now, would grieve, quietly and privately, for the version of their mother they had not quite had access to, and would understand, in the same quiet and private way, that she had not had access to it either. Others would not make this connection, would simply carry, somewhere in their adult selves, a template for what it looked like to manage to be present, to be functional, to be consistently there for everyone in the household at some cost to the fullness of your own experience, without acknowledging the cost because the cost was not visible from the outside and was not discussed and did not have a name. The template passed. Templates do. Your husband did not, in most cases, know. This is worth stating clearly and without excessive judgment, because the not knowing was structural rather than willful. He came home at 6:20 to a house that was running correctly. The dinner was ready. The children were managed. You were composed. He had spent the day in the professional world, which had its own considerable demands, and he came home to a domestic world that appeared, by every available measure, to be functioning well. He did not have occasion to notice what was in the medicine cabinet above the sink, because the medicine cabinet above the sink was your domain, and the contents of your domain were not a subject that either of you had established as a site of inquiry. He was not unkind. He was not inattentive in any way that would have registered, in 1963, as a failure. He came home. He ate the dinner. He read the paper. He asked reasonable questions about reasonable subjects. He was a husband of his time, which meant that his relationship to the domestic sphere was one of benevolent occupancy rather than shared management. It was her house in the sense that she ran it. It was his house in the sense that his life happened inside it. The distinction between these two descriptions of the same house was not, in 1963, something that either of them had language for, and in the absence of language the distinction remained unexamined, and in remaining unexamined it continued to produce the precise conditions that were being addressed, at 8:30 every morning, with a small white tablet. He did notice sometimes that she seemed tired. He said so. She said she was fine. He accepted this because she was, by every external measure, fine, and because accepting it was what the available script provided for, and because the alternative, pursuing the question past the point where she had indicated it was settled, would have required a kind of conversation that the era had not built into the architecture of marriage. She was fine. The house was fine. The children were fine. The lawn was mowed on Saturday morning, and the casserole was in the oven on Wednesday, and the prescription was renewed every 6 weeks by the physician on the second floor of the professional building on the main commercial street, and the suburb turned through its seasons with the slow, settled regularity of something that has found a working arrangement and has no mechanism for questioning whether the arrangement is working for everyone inside it. It was working. From a certain angle, in a certain light, with certain questions not being asked, it was absolutely working. From another angle, from the inside of the medicine cabinet, from the inside of the small white tablet dissolving at 8:30 on a Wednesday morning, from the inside of the woman whose awareness of her own life was being chemically adjusted to a bearable level, it was something more complicated than working, and the complication was not going to stay private indefinitely. The question of what the drugs were actually doing not to the anxiety symptoms, but to the women experiencing those symptoms, to their capacity for the full range of their own experience, to their access to the feelings that might have pointed toward the structural sources of their distress, was not a question that the medical literature was organized to ask in 1963. The medical literature was organized around efficacy and safety, and on both measures the tranquilizers performed acceptably. Efficacy. The anxiety symptoms were reduced. Safety. At prescribed doses, the immediate risks were manageable. What the measures did not capture, because no one had designed a measure for it, was the quality of life inside the reduction. What it felt like to have your anxiety managed over years. What you lost access to in the process of losing access to the anxiety. Whether the thing being managed was separable from other things, other feelings, other responses, other parts of your own inner life that you had not consented to losing access to, and that no one had mentioned you would. The women who later described this period, in interviews and memoirs and congressional testimony, were remarkably consistent on one point, that they had not known what they were agreeing to when they agreed to take the prescription, not because anyone had deceived them, but because the question of what they were agreeing to had not been part of the conversation. The conversation had been about the symptoms. The treatment was for the symptoms. The experience of living inside the treatment over years was not something the conversation had covered. This is the gap that the women's health movement of the 1970s began to address. Not loudly, initially, not in the legislative chambers or the medical journals where the male-dominated institutions of American healthcare were doing their work. In living rooms, in the small community spaces that women had carved out of the domestic landscape for exactly the kind of conversation that the domestic landscape was not designed to accommodate. Consciousness-raising groups, women's health collectives. The small, regular meetings where women who had been living inside the same experience without knowing that other women were living inside the same experience finally said so to each other. The saying so was not a small thing. In a culture that had spent 20 years insisting that the correct domestic arrangement was the natural and fulfilling arrangement, in a suburb built on the architectural assumption that a woman at home was a woman in her proper place, saying so, saying that the proper place had produced this particular kind of distress, and this particular kind of medication, and this particular kind of quiet disappearance, was an act that required something. The women who did it were not heroic in any dramatic sense. They were women who had gotten tired of not saying so, which is a quieter kind of courage than the dramatic kind, and which produces, in the long run, more durable results. Let's go back to the very beginning of this, because the beginning is not 1955 when Miltown arrived. The beginning is earlier and quieter, and it is located in the specific conditions of the post-war American household that made the arrival of Miltown not a surprise but an inevitability. The decade that preceded the tranquilizer was not a decade of ease. It looked like ease from certain angles, the prosperity was real, the consumer goods were multiplying, the houses in the new suburbs were larger than anything the previous generation had inhabited, the appliances were modern and efficient, and the magazine photographs showed them gleaming. But underneath the gleaming was the weight of a transition that had happened faster than the culture had developed the resources to manage. The women who would become the housewives of the 1950s had, many of them, spent their late teens and early 20s in a different kind of life. The war years had moved women into the workforce in numbers that had no precedent. The Rosie the Riveter image was iconic because it captured something real, the experience of competence, of consequence, of work that produced a visible and valued result. Women who had spent 3 or 4 years doing skilled industrial work, or administrative work, or the dozens of other things that the male-depleted wartime labour market had required of them, had developed a relationship with their own capacities that was different from what the domestic ideology of the 1950s would ask them to bring to the kitchen. Then the men came home. The economy contracted around civilian production. The demographic pressure of millions of young men returning to a labour market they expected to re-enter pushed women back toward the domestic sphere, with a social force that was all the stronger for being understood as natural rather than structural. You were not being pushed. You were returning to your proper role. You were going home. The going home was in many cases welcome. The war years had been exhausting in ways that the historical record does not always capture: the anxiety of uncertainty, the management of household and work simultaneously without the infrastructure that would later be called childcare, the specific loneliness of a household without a husband. The prospect of settling into peace, into stability, into a life organized around family rather than around the war's requirements was genuinely appealing to many of the women making the transition. But appealing and adequate are not the same thing, and the decade that followed revealed the gap between them with a slowness that was its own kind of torment. The life was good, by the measures available. The house was good. The husband was good. The children were good. And in the midst of the goodness, in the clean kitchen, in the quiet morning, something was wrong in a way that did not have a name, and the not having a name was its own compounding problem, because a thing without a name is a thing that cannot be addressed, and a thing that cannot be addressed becomes, over years, a thing that must be managed. The management took whatever form was available. It took the form of the ladies' home journal's cheerful instructions about the proper way to receive guests and the correct temperature for a baked ham. It took the form of the neighbourhood's social calendar, the bridge clubs and the garden clubs, and the PTA committees that gave the day a structure beyond the household's own requirements. It took the form of reading the women who read, in the late evenings when the household was finally still, with the speed of people recovering something that had been temporarily out of reach. And when those forms of management were insufficient, which they were for more women than the decade could comfortably acknowledge, it took the form of a small white tablet prescribed by a physician on the second floor of a professional building on a commercial street, renewed every 6 weeks without meaningful examination, taken every morning with the second cup of coffee. The tablet worked. That is the important thing to hold on to as you try to understand why so many women took it for so long. It worked in the specific, real, daily sense of making the manageable more manageable and the unmanageable slightly less acute. It did not address the source. It addressed the response. And for women who had been living with the source for years without access to any mechanism for addressing it, without the language, without the framework, without the social permission to say that the source was the problem, addressing the response was what was available. You took what was available. People always take what is available. The question the subsequent decades were forced to ask was whether what was available should have been the only thing available, and whether the people in a position to offer more than what was available had been adequately motivated to do so. The answer was complicated and was answered differently by different people with different investments in the outcome, but the question was asked. It had not been asked before. That was something. There were women for whom the story ended differently. Not every woman who was prescribed tranquilizers in the 1950s and 1960s stayed on them. Not every woman who took Miltown in 1957 was still taking its successor in 1972. Some women stopped early and without difficulty, before physiological dependence had consolidated, and moved through the rest of their lives with the original prescription as a footnote rather than a chapter. There were women who took the prescription and did not fill it, who sat with the amber bottle in the car outside the pharmacy, thought about what they were doing, and decided to try something else first. Some of them found something else, and the something else was sufficient. Some of them found nothing else and went back to fill the prescription, and in going back made a different kind of choice than the women who had never paused. There were women who took the pills and found them useful for a defined period and managed, without particular difficulty, to stop when the period ended. These women exist in the data as success stories, as evidence that the drugs worked as drugs are supposed to work, and they are real, and their experience was real, and it is not a distortion of the historical record to include them. The distortion would be to describe them as the typical case, which they were not. There were women who took the pills and noticed, earlier than most, that something about the relationship between the pills and themselves was not behaving like a simple medical treatment, and who said so to their physicians, and whose physicians heard them and took it seriously and helped them stop, and whose stopping was managed carefully and was not as hard as it was for many others. These women exist too, and their experience matters. And there were the women who took the pills for a decade or more and found the stopping, when they tried it, to be the hardest thing they had attempted, who went through the withdrawal with or without support, who came out the other side into a world that had changed during their years of partial absence from their own full experience, and who had to make something of that changed world with the capacities that had been waiting, mostly intact, for the management to be lifted. These women are the majority of the story, in the sense that their numbers were the largest, and their experience was the most sustained and the most completely invisible to the culture that was producing it. They're also the most important part of the story because they are the ones who, when they found their way to the other side, had the most to say about what they had been inside of. What they said, in the living rooms and the community centres, and eventually the congressional hearing rooms, was not organised around blame. It was organised around description. This is what happened. This is what it felt like from the inside. This is what was not said to us when it should have been, and this is why it matters that you say it now to the women for whom it is still happening, in whatever form it is currently happening. The description was important because it was the first time the experience had been described as an experience rather than as a treatment. The pharmaceutical apparatus had been describing it as a treatment effective, indicated, producing outcomes consistent with the treatment goals. The women were describing it as something that had happened to them, which is a different kind of description, and which produces different kinds of understanding, and which requires different kinds of response. The response came slowly. It is still coming, in some respects. The relationship between women and the medical institution that manages their care has changed in the decades since, and changed in ways that would not have been possible without the describing. But the relationship has not changed as completely as the describing would have warranted, and the pattern of women receiving pharmaceutical responses to structural conditions has not been resolved, only relocated, and the conversation about it continues in forms that the women of 1962 would recognize even if they would not recognize the specific drugs or the specific diagnoses. The conversation continues. It is the same conversation. It began, in the form that made it visible, in living rooms, in the evenings, among women who had finally decided that the thing they were not saying was more important than the reason they weren't saying it. That decision was not dramatic. It looked like women sitting in someone's living room talking. It looked, from the outside, like nothing in particular. From the inside, it was the beginning of something that has not yet finished. There is a specific quality to a house at 2 p.m. on a weekday in the early 1960s that is difficult to describe to someone who has not been inside it. Not the house itself, which looks like any other house from the outside, the shutters painted the correct colour, the lawn cut at the correct height, the curtains in the front windows positioned with the correct degree of casual arrangement. The quality is interior. It is in the silence of the rooms and in the particular light that comes through curtains at that hour, and it is in the presence of the woman inside the silence, who has been alone in these rooms since 8 o'clock this morning, who will be alone in them until 3:15 when the children come home, who has done everything the morning required and everything the afternoon requires, and who is now, in the interval between the two, in the room that is most entirely hers, the kitchen, where the ironing board is set up, or the living room, where the mending basket sits by the chair inside a quality of solitude that is not peace. Peace is something you choose. This is something you are inside of. The distinction is not one the domestic guides of the era discussed. They discussed efficiency and hospitality, and the management of household finances, and the correct approach to removing a grass stain from cotton. They did not discuss the quality of a Tuesday afternoon in October, alone in a clean house, with the radio on and the ironing to finish, and the sense that the hours between now and 3:15 are both very full and absolutely without witness. The Valium addressed this quality, not by filling the hours with something they had not previously contained, but by adjusting your relationship to the quality of the hours, moving you slightly back from the sharp interior edge of the solitude, making the unwitnessed afternoon feel less like a verdict and more like weather. Weather is simply what is happening. It does not implicate you. The Valium made the Tuesday afternoon feel more like weather. This was not a small thing. In the years before the prescription, the Tuesday afternoons had felt like something more personal than weather, which is to say, they had felt like a question, and the question was one you had not yet developed the framework to answer. The Valium did not answer the question. It made the question easier to live with, which is a different outcome, and which appeared, in the moment of living with it, to be sufficient. It was sufficient for as long as you needed it to be sufficient. And then it was not. The moment when it was not is harder to locate than you might expect. It did not arrive with drama or announcement. It arrived as a gradual shifting of the ratio between what the pills were providing and what you were beginning to understand they were preventing. The understanding was slow. It came from things you were reading and conversations you were beginning to have, and a general change in the available vocabulary the culture was, in the late 1960s and into the 1970s, beginning to produce language for experiences that had not previously had language, and some of that language was reaching you through the books and the articles and the Tuesday evening gatherings that had begun to appear in the landscape of your social life. The Tuesday evenings were different from the bridge club. The bridge club had a clear and established social format with known roles and known conversation. Registers the light, the social, the performance of contentment that the suburb required. The Tuesday evenings were something that had assembled itself more recently and more deliberately, in a living room 2 streets over, among a group of women who had decided, without formally deciding, that they were going to say things to each other that they had not been saying. The first few times you went, you were not sure what you were doing there. The conversation was not like anything you had experienced in a social context. It was direct, in a way that the social contexts you knew were not. Women were saying things about their marriages and their days and their sense of themselves that you had not heard said out loud, and the saying of them did not produce the social consequences that the performance of contentment was designed to prevent. Nothing collapsed. Nobody left. The room continued. And in the room the conversation continued. And in the conversation something was happening that you did not have a word for yet, but that felt. Sitting in the corner chair with your hands in your lap, like the particular relief of realizing that a thing you had been carrying alone was not, in fact, yours alone to carry. It had not been yours alone. It had never been yours alone. The solitude of the Tuesday afternoon, the unwitnessed hours, the question that had no framework had been the experience of most of the women in that room, in their specific kitchens, on their specific streets, in the specific silence of a life organized around the absence of exactly the thing they were currently doing, talking to each other about what the life was actually like. You drove home at 10:30. The street was quiet, the houses dark, your husband already asleep. You stood in the kitchen for a moment before going up, and the kitchen was clean and still, and in the clean stillness you were aware, with unusual clarity, of the distance between how you usually experienced this room and how you had just spent the last 2 hours. The room was the same room. Something had shifted in the person standing in it. You went upstairs. You did not take the Seconal. You lay in the dark and your mind ran its usual inventory, but the inventory felt different, more like material than like weight, things to be thought about rather than things to be managed. The distinction was subtle and important, and you held it in the dark until you fell asleep, which took longer than it had when the Seconal was doing it, and was also more fully yours. This was the beginning of the end of the prescription, though the end would take another 1.5 years to arrive and would be difficult and would require help that you were not certain you deserved to ask for. But this was where it started, in a kitchen at 10:30 at night, in the dark, with an inventory that felt, for the first time in a long time, like something you could engage with, rather than something you needed to survive. The inventory was yours. It had always been yours. The pills had been managing your relationship to it. The pills were not, it turned out, the only available way to manage that relationship. There were others. They were harder, in the ways that things that don't involve medication are harder, but they produced a different quality of outcome. They produced a quality of outcome that felt, when you were inside it, like you. The pharmaceutical industry did not sit still while this shift was occurring. It adapted, as industries adapt, by locating the next available market and organizing the available products around it. The next available market, as the benzodiazepine era began its slow decline in the late 1970s and into the 1980s, was depression. Not depression as the clinical literature understood it in its most severe forms, which had always been a legitimate target for medical intervention. Depression as a broad population-level category that could absorb much of what the previous era had described as anxiety, and which could be addressed with a new class of compounds whose mechanisms were different, whose dependency profiles were different, and whose cultural narrative was different in ways that made them easier to prescribe and more acceptable to receive. The selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the SSRIs, Prozac, most famously among them, arrived in the late 1980s carrying a cultural frame that distinguished them, in the public imagination, and to a significant extent in the clinical culture, from the Valium that had come before. Valium was sedation. Valium was the housewife in the kitchen, the anxiety that comes from not fitting in. Valium carried, by the late 1970s, a stigma that had been assembled by the very reckoning that was driving its decline. The new drugs were framed differently. They were antidepressants, which implied that they were treating an illness rather than adjusting a disposition. They were described in terms that emphasized neurochemistry rather than behavioral management. They were, in the cultural shorthand of the era, more scientific, which made them feel more legitimate, which made prescribing and receiving them feel like a different kind of transaction than the Valium transaction had been. Whether they were a different kind of transaction or a similar transaction in updated clothing is a question that the history of the subsequent decades has not fully answered, and may not fully answer for some time. What the history does show is that the broad pattern continued, women receiving pharmaceutical responses to conditions with identifiable social dimensions, in numbers that substantially exceeded the corresponding figures for men, in a clinical culture that had improved in some respects and retained in others the features that had characterized the Valium era. The improvements were real. The regulatory environment was stronger. The patient information was more complete. The clinical culture had more tools for assessing dependency and more incentive to use them. The women receiving these prescriptions were, on average, better informed about what they were taking than the women who had received Miltown prescriptions in 1957 had been. The structural continuities were also real. A woman sitting in a physician's office in 1990, describing fatigue and a persistent low-level difficulty feeling engaged with her days, was still, in many clinical encounters, being heard through a framework that located the problem inside her chemistry rather than inside the structure of her circumstances. The diagnosis had updated. The pharmaceutical response had updated. The underlying relationship between the medical institution and the experiences of women in the domestic sphere had changed more slowly than either of these. This is not a counsel of despair. It is an observation about the pace at which structural change moves relative to the pace at which pharmacological products move, and about the tendency of systems to locate solutions in the most immediately available form, rather than the most structurally adequate form. The pharmaceutical response to women's distress was, and to some extent remains, the most immediately available form. It is available in a physician's office. It is covered by insurance in ways that other responses are not. It is fast, in the sense that a prescription can be written in minutes. The structural alternatives, genuine accommodation of the conditions producing the distress, are slow and expensive and require coordination across institutions that are not primarily organized around that kind of accommodation. The women of 1962, taking their Miltown with the second cup of coffee, were inside a version of this problem that would not be named, let alone addressed, for another decade. The women who came after them, in their various configurations and with their various prescriptions and their varying degrees of information about what those prescriptions were doing, have been navigating increasingly named versions of the same problem. The navigation is easier with names. It is not finished because the names are available. The medicine cabinet in 2024 contains different bottles than the medicine cabinet in 1962 contained. The conversations happening around those bottles are more informed, more medically literate, more clearly the conversations of people who understand that they have the right to ask questions and receive answers and decline if they choose. The women having those conversations are not the women of 1962, but the quality of a Tuesday afternoon in October, alone in a quiet house, with the hours stretching between the end of the morning's tasks and the return of the children, with the question that doesn't have quite the right framework yet, hovering somewhere in the still air. That quality has not changed in any way that a pill has been able to address, because it is not, and was not, and has never been, a chemical problem. It is the particular shape of a life, and the particular experience of being inside it, and the particular human need to be asked how you are doing, not as a social pleasantry, but as a genuine inquiry, and to have the answer received by someone who is not going to write a prescription in 45 seconds. And move on to the next patient. The amber bottle is in the cabinet. The day is very long. The kettle is on. Someone should ask. So here you are, at the end of an evening that went inside a medicine cabinet and stayed there for a while. You've sat with a woman in a 1962 kitchen taking her Miltown with the second cup of coffee, the children already gone, the house quiet, the day arranged entirely around everyone else's requirements. You've stood with her at the ironing board on a Tuesday afternoon in October, the radio on, her hands moving through the collar cuffs sleeves body sequence without being asked to, the drug making the repetition feel less like repetition, and more like the texture of a particular kind of endurance. You've followed her through the evening's careful performance, the changed dress, the composed arrival in the living room, the dinner managed and cleared, and the children put to bed, and the 10:50 Seconal, and the quiet of the house at last, and the 20 minutes before that, alone with the television and the thought she hadn't found a place for. You've seen the advertisements in the medical journals, the middle-aged woman behind a wall of textbooks, the suggested treatment. You've watched the prescriptions climb toward 2.3 billion tablets in a single year. You've sat with the women in the congressional hearings describing, in careful public language, what the private years had actually felt like. The women who lived this were not weak. Let that be said clearly. From this distance, with everything the subsequent decades made visible, they were doing what rational people do when medical authority tells them a treatment is indicated. The dependency that developed was not a moral failure. It was a physiological event that no one explained to them when the prescription was written. In 45 seconds, in an office where they had gone to describe a feeling that had no name yet. They managed as well as the available tools allowed, which is what people have always done, and what the people inside that particular decade were doing with unusual thoroughness, under unusual pressure, with unusual quiet. What is worth holding as you drift towards sleep is the particular kind of courage required to feel what you have not been allowed to feel. The woman at the kitchen table in 1974, the cabinet closed, nothing between her and the morning. She is not doing anything that looks like courage from the outside. She is just sitting at a table with a cup of tea. But she is sitting there with all of herself present, uncomfortable and unmedicated, and entirely her own, and that presence, after years of its partial absence, is its own small act of reclamation. The problem that had no name in 1962 had several names by 1974. They were incomplete names. They were contested names. They were nowhere near sufficient for the full weight of what they were trying to describe. But they existed in books she could take out of the library, in conversations she could have with other women who were having the same conversation in other kitchens on other streets, and that was different from before. Before there had been the pill and the prescription and the 45 seconds and the medicine cabinet above the sink, the walls of the house were the same walls, but there were words for them now. Tonight, wherever you are, in whatever version of rest, is available to you with access to healthcare information your doctor cannot simply withhold, with the right to read the label and ask what's in it and decline if you want to, with something at least approximating the vocabulary for what you feel and why you feel it. Maybe spare a quiet thought for the women who had none of that, who took what they were given because they trusted that the person giving it knew what they needed, who moved through their days in a chemical softening of their own experience and managed the household and raised the children and performed the evenings and never said a word about it, not because they couldn't, but because the era had not yet built a place to put what they would have said. They were there, in every suburb, behind every clean window, at every spotless kitchen table, getting through the day. They got through it, sleep well. The medicine cabinet is closed, the house is quiet. The kettle has gone cold on the stove and the morning is still a few hours away, and somewhere in a suburb that no longer quite looks like it did, a woman is sitting with both hands around a cup, and nothing between her and the day coming toward her, and she has decided without ceremony, without anyone watching, that she is going to be all right. She's going to need a minute, but she's going to be all right.